Narcissism is nuanced, it's complex, and it's tricky. It's like a toxic box of candy where all of the pieces of candy look the same, but may taste different based on what is in the middle. So let's dispel this myth once and for all, that all narcissistic people are vain and appearance conscious. Because all of us know someone who is narcissistic, who is clearly not that focused on their appearance. And this is actually a dangerous myth, because we may think that the person who isn't pulled together or doesn't meet some standard of attractiveness or grooming or isn't over-focused on always looking their best or their cosmetic procedures or going to the gym all the time and spending hours on their appearance would be easily for us to then think, well, maybe they're not narcissistic, even though their behavior is consistent with narcissism. And alternately, it also runs the risk that even when a person is not showing any behavior that's consistent with narcissism, but just happens to be someone who is very appearance focused, we may disengage or step away from them or look at them suspiciously because we think they're narcissistic. Remember, understanding the patterns of narcissism is not about definitively determining whether or not someone is narcissistic. It's recognizing that once all these patterns that comprise narcissism all start hanging together, and that it's a pattern, and that this pattern is one that is not likely to change. So you need to make your decisions and honestly calibrate your expectations about the relationship accordingly. Now, unfortunately, this term narcissism was originally drawn from a myth about a young man who fell in love with his reflection. And once that word was brought into play of narcissism and that narcissist myth, from forever forward, we automatically associated narcissism with vanity. But vanity is just one and actually rather skinny thread of the complex tapestry of narcissism. Really, it's not a very impactful or significant part of the narcissism picture. The harm of narcissism comes about from the behaviors that are associated with it and the lack of consideration or awareness of the feelings or needs of other people who are around the narcissistic person. That's why it hurts. Vanity doesn't hurt just because someone's spending an extra hour at the gym, or because someone's getting yet another something or other injected into their face, or spends lots of time on their makeup, or has endless racks of clothing in a closet. That's not. I mean, those things could, and we'll get to the could in a moment. But the vanity stuff isn't often what is causing the problems in the relationship. Sadly, all this stuff related to vanity may be what makes narcissistic people so attractive to everyone. And there is, in fact, research indicating that people who score higher on narcissism questionnaires are also often judged as more attractive by people who don't even know that they're narcissistic, right? And narcissistic people also do report more concern about their appearance, more concern with other people's appearances, and they do spend more time on how they look. So all that time, at least in a subset of narcissistic folks, can result in a really good-looking set of people. And side note, I will say that it is often the narcissistic folks who, when there is a mirror around, will quickly gravitate to using it as a grooming tool and almost lose track of whatever is going on around them. I remember many, many years ago, I had rented a part-time therapy office. And the therapy office wasn't mine, someone else had set it up. And it had a mirror that was placed in sort of an unfortunate manner, kind of, the way it was placed, it was basically in the eye line of the client on the couch. They could see it and they could see themselves. And invariably, the narcissistic clients would sometimes lose their train of thought because they were so caught up with their reflection in the mirror. Ultimately, because of the nature of my practice, I was working with a lot of narcissistic clients, I ended up moving the mirror, but I digress. They do care about their appearance. And just like at least many adult intimate relationships begin, to put it mildly, you might have wanted to go out with them simply because you thought they were hot. And they may very well have been hot. And it is amazing how much BS we are willing to put up with in the name of hotness. Here's a life hack. Stop making excuses. No one is hot enough to get away with gaslighting you. But enough of you are listening to this and thinking, actually, I was the hot one. Or you might also be thinking, they were definitely not hot. And maybe they were not even that well put together, or maybe they weren't even that aware of their own appearance. Because as part of the narcissistic person's vanity, it may not just be their own appearance that they focus on, but also the appearance of others. So they want to be surrounded by beautiful people. And they may choose partners or friends solely based on what they look like. They may even choose business associates on the same level, on the same basis as well. They may also be focused, the vanity may mean that they're focused on beautiful objects, cars, or the way their home is put together, or jewelry, or other adornments, clothing, and fashion. And the beautiful objects, all these beautiful things they want around them, that's not the issue. If that's what they want to do, fine. But it's when the person's over-focused on all of that to the detriment of other people. That's when we steer into narcissism territory. Wanting to be surrounded by beautiful things, fine. But to the detriment of others, now we have a problem. Now, some people have read descriptions of narcissism or watched narcissism content or read narcissism books that attempt to oversimplify narcissism. And then they get nervous. They'll say, but I love fashion. I love makeup. I love my muscle cars. I like being told I'm attractive. I just enjoy those things. Does that mean I'm narcissistic? Not necessarily. Loving those things, loving looking a certain way, being invested in that does not a narcissist make. Narcissism is an inside and an outside job. Inside, a narcissistic person is deeply insecure, fragile, and filled with shame. And this is all unprocessed stuff. So it comes out in unpleasant ways towards other people. And the narcissistic person is often focused on managing an exterior self that gets validation, or with managing the discomfort of feeling like they are not getting the validation they believe they deserve. For example, like we would see in vulnerable narcissism, that they are always edgy and either trying to get validation or they're angry because they aren't getting validation, and also that they needing to control the narrative and feeding the grandiose self in order to kind of keep that insecure self at bay. So they are entitled and they're controlling. Does that whole thing make sense? So vanity is part of a complex machine of narcissism, and it isn't necessarily the hurtful part. If you are aware of the beautiful things you love, or that you do like to invest in your appearance or care about your appearance, or that it matters to you, and you're able to also simultaneously be self-reflective and empathic and regulated and kind, then that's not the same thing as narcissistic vanity. Now, if the vanity-focused person is, for example, spending desperately needed family resources on their fancy cars or fashion or cosmetic procedures or whatever it is they're doing to look the way they want to look, that's a problem, and it is hurtful and harmful. If the vain person is so obsessive about their appearance that they become selfish, and it becomes literally their primary focus to the negligence of their relationships and responsibilities, that's hurtful. And if you were to call them out on those patterns and they clap back and say, well, I'm doing all of this for you, to look good for you. You're so selfish and cruel that you won't let me do what I need to do to feel good about myself. Well, then that's gaslighting and manipulative. So it's patterns like the selfishness and the neglect and the lack of empathy and gaslighting and manipulation. All that stuff drives the hurt, not just the vanity per se. And when we dig deeper into this vanity as narcissism issue, we hit up against those malignant and vulnerable narcissistic folks where this doesn't really track, right? Even to some degree, the self-righteous ones. In these subtypes of narcissism, vulnerable and malignant in particular, we don't typically see vanity as a guiding quality. As you get to know the person, you might see it pop out in different ways. They might make sort of digging, cruel comments about other people's appearance. They may make snobby or sneering comments about your appearance or something you're wearing or something you own. But there is an apathy in vulnerable narcissism that often doesn't translate to vanity. Or if we do see the focus on external appearance, for example, lots of vanity hours in a gym. And by vanity hours, I mean this is not a person who is exercising for fitness, but solely just to make their body look a certain way or the clothes a certain way or whatever. They will have an aggrieved, victimized nature about it. For example, who does that woman think she is? She's a 7 and I'm ripped. F her. That kind of victimized, why can't everyone see how great and how hot I am sort of thing. Because so much of what we talk about when it comes to narcissism is grandiose narcissism, where vanity is in fact such a central part of the presentation, we often view vanity as a defining quality of narcissism. Remember, all of the traits of narcissism, including superficiality and vanity, only hurt when they translate to behavior that affects other people, words, actions, that kind of thing. If a narcissistic person is fastidious about their appearance, always has to look impeccable, and that's how they get their narcissistic supply, okay. But the harms of it may not be felt until you are insulted by them. Or that their 3-hour skincare routine means that they won't take your calls or show up on time to something that matters to you. Or their desire for a hot partner means that they will dump you after a few years for the next shiny new thing. That's when it's hurtful. But vanity as a central defining quality, it's not only misleading, as I said, in terms of identifying narcissism, it can often lead us to misseeing these patterns as part of a consistent package of narcissism. Or it can also lead to unfair characterizations of a sort of vain and superficial person who isn't necessarily mean or unempathic or manipulative. They may be deeply uninteresting, superficial, vapid, or banal. But those things don't qualify as emotional abuse. Dull, maybe. Abusive? No, not in of themselves. But just as an expert tip, if you are on a date with someone in a restaurant or bar with lots of mirrors, make sure you're the one facing it. Otherwise, the narcissistic person will not even know you're there. So one thing we got to get into the habit of doing is we got to stop treating charm and charisma as though they are defining characteristics of narcissism. People who are in relationships with covert narcissistic folks or vulnerable narcissistic folks or just your basic, not really successful or unlikable narcissistic folks are often confused. Because the toxic person in their life does not have charm, charisma, maybe even not success. And they assume, well, whatever this is, this awfulness, I don't think it's narcissism. But they still have these things with this person in their life. There's very little empathy, there's pathological selfishness, there's entitlement, there's arrogance, there's angry. But they're not as polished or snazzy as two-faced as what people are believing narcissism is. So let's go back to basics on what narcissism is. I don't think we can have enough reviews on this. It's a personality, so it's consistent. This is not how someone is on just one afternoon on the day they lost their job. This is how they are. And yes, they can turn it off and on in some cases with different people. But regularly these patterns will show up, especially with people where they feel that they've locked in the supply, such as family members or spouses or people who work for them. Now, while some personality styles can be a little flexible, narcissism is maladaptive and rigid and doesn't really change much. So it's even more consistent no matter what you do to try and address the behaviors. It has some fundamental patterns associated with it. Low variable empathy, very little emotional empathy, entitlement and grandiosity, pathological selfishness, and either an excessive need for admiration and validation, or the arrogant belief that they deserve lots of admiration and validation, and they don't get it. And when they don't get it, they rage, and they believe they deserve it. This translates into manipulation, domination, betrayal, rage, passive aggression, and playing the victim when they don't get their way. Things like invalidation, future faking, all of it. Now, nowhere on this list, you'll notice, are charm and charisma. These are qualities that can be present and are often part of the entire love-bombed, confusing picture, but they are not what we call qualifiers for narcissism. Variable empathy, entitlement, arrogance, those things are qualifiers for narcissism. Without that, this is not narcissism. But charm and charisma are not qualifiers. The charm and charisma can make trauma bonding more trauma bonded, right? It can make healing from these relationships tough. The charm and charisma made this an attractive person to you and to the world. They can be perceived as being quite socially successful, which again can make you quite confused. It can be maddening to see them charm and chariz other people and get away with stuff and have people be so charmed by them, and then to have them be an asshole to you behind closed doors. It can mean you get less support or you are viewed as the problem. But charm and charisma, again, not a requirement for narcissism. And when the narcissistic person or narcissistic relationship you're in, charm and charisma aren't present, you are more likely dealing with vulnerable, malignant, or even self-righteous narcissism. And in most cases, you are dealing with a sort of a base of vulnerable narcissism. There is so much confusion with these terms, vulnerable narcissist or covert narcissist. So let's just, again, do another review there. Vulnerable narcissism is that sort of victimized, sullen, passive-aggressive, grumbling, socially awkward, aggrieved, can't get along with everyone, failure to launch narcissism. These are often not charming and charismatic folks. They can be a little clunky socially. They may lose jobs because they don't have the slick ability to get along with everyone, or be shiny, or be Machiavellian and political. They can react to frustration or to not getting their way with either the silent treatment or being loudly rageful. They may not always hold back on their messy rage in front of other people either. Because the sort of shiny social exterior, that charm and charisma we see in grandiose narcissists, is often missing with vulnerable narcissistic people. And you may even feel sorry for them because it feels like that vulnerable narcissistic person, like things really aren't going their way. The trauma bonding here is worse because there is more pity and guilt on your part. And you may not even realize that you are dealing with narcissism. So you may just think you're walking away from a difficult relationship from someone who is struggling, which they may be, rather than walking away from or disengaging from someone who doesn't treat you well, who doesn't respect you, but seems to be doing great in the world, right? Because vulnerable narcissistic people can look sad and anxious and never get going and don't launch, they aren't exactly the life of the party. The other stuff, like the low empathy and the belief that their lives should be easier than other people's lives and that the world is out to get them and the whole witch hunt thing, can get missed as them just being sad or odd or difficult or even just pathetic, rather than all that shiny narcissistic stuff. Then there is this word covert. And this is what really muddies the water, because people are using it to mean lots of things. Some people are using the word covert to mean the narcissistic person who is mean to them, but is so charming with everyone else, or at least normal with everyone else. And the covert, the word covert means hidden part, is that the narcissistic person keeps all their meanness and manipulation and rage and gaslighting under wraps when other people are around. Other people are using covert narcissism to mean the same thing as vulnerable narcissism, meaning that it is less charm and charisma and more grievances and passive aggression. Narcissism researchers take covert to mean the stuff that happens within the narcissist, their thoughts and their feelings, while the overt stuff is what they actually do and say. For example, monopolize the conversation. So you can see this, using this word covert gets messy. Now, the charm and charisma are such a classical part of love bombing and are sort of part of the popular framework of the slick, attractive, superficial, vain, narcissistic person who posts lots of selfies. And as I said, that misses the entire picture. People in relationships with folks who have all the narcissistic bells and whistles like charm and charisma are more likely to understand nowadays what they are up against and to be able to start the healing work. But when charm and charisma are viewed as sort of required characteristics, many people in vulnerable narcissistic relationships sort of miss it. And so they don't fully recognize that this is a pattern, which includes the manipulation, the confusion that they are experiencing these relationships. And while more people may see what happens to the people who are in these relationships and what they're experiencing, because vulnerable narcissistic folks are often isolating or may not hold back from being sort of grumpy and sullen or critical in front of other people, there's still confusion with the most common justification people who make for vulnerable narcissistic relationships and people being that they're just going through a tough time. That's why they're kind of being a jerk. Interestingly, instead of charm and charisma, something I do often observe in vulnerable narcissistic folks is that when they are, for example, smart, really smart, that is what kind of has that charm and charisma effect. If the vulnerable person is really smart about something, it can often lead people to excuse their difficult behavior. Yeah, I know, he can be a handful, he just speaks his mind, but he's a financial genius. But I didn't forget those other types, malignant and self-righteous. Malignant narcissistic folks are also not always charming and charismatic. They can be sort of bullyish and controlling feeling from the beginning, a little bit scary. A person excusing the malignant narcissistic person's behavior may view it as a take charge kind of style. And in people who may be more vulnerable to coercion, for example, when there's a big power difference between the malignant narcissistic person and the person getting into the relationship, or in people who may not have lots of support, or who have experienced other unresolved relational betrayals and traumas, right? Then there may be a sort of capitulation, a giving in to the control of the malignant narcissist because they just don't have the supports, and the coercion is such psychological manipulation. With self-righteous narcissistic folks, again, they're often not also charming and charismatic, but they may be very responsible, upstanding, hardworking, religious, organized, things that we may view as virtues, and may lead us to miss that these self-righteous folks are also very judgmental, invalidating, critical, rigid, morally superior. Or when they are like this, we may view it as being a part of our failings because we're a little messy, or sometimes we sleep in, or maybe we eat candy in bed, or maybe I'm just talking about myself. So narcissist as leader, narcissist as selfie-posing, Instagram-obsessed friend, narcissist as love-bombing cheater, narcissist as sports car driving show-off, maybe, but not always. That superficial surface stuff makes it hard for some folks because it can make the relationship more enticing and create one kind of trauma bond. But when these other non-charm charisma types show up, you may miss the toxic patterns: entitlement, variable empathy, low empathy, pathological selfishness, that excessive need for admiration and validation, or the arrogance and anger about not getting it. The trauma bond may be embedded in the guilt around leaving someone who's sort of pathetic, or the fear around someone who is scary. Narcissism is nuanced, it's complex, and it's tricky. It's like a toxic box of candy where all of the pieces of candy look the same, but may taste different based on what is in the middle. So while one person may be eating a charming, charismatic, betraying, invalidating, grandiose, entitled bonbon, you may be nibbling on an angry, aggrieved, smart, entitled, socially anxious caramel. Don't get lost in the idea of they aren't charming and charismatic, or they are like this in front of other people. They're angry and ragey in front of other people, so it can't be narcissism. Narcissism is about the patterns, public or private, drizzled in charm and charisma or not. And why does this matter? Because understanding this can break you out of self-blame, self-doubt, confusion cycles, and help you radically accept, maintain realistic expectations, and disengage, and ultimately to heal. So here's the key question. Do narcissists actually not have empathy? Or do they have empathy and choose not to use it? Let's start by breaking down the central sort of definition of narcissism, or even narcissistic personality disorder. And one of the key elements that comes up diagnostically, it's sort of number one, is that they lack empathy, okay? Nowhere does it say that they don't have empathy. It says that they have less empathy. So right out the gate, we know that they have some preserved capacity for empathy. All right, well, that's troubling, because anyone who's been in a narcissistic relationship will say, it feels like my partner has no empathy, or more problematic, they'll say, I feel like this person has empathy sometimes, but not all of the time. And that's probably a more accurate depiction. I like to view narcissism as a pattern where there's diminished empathy, but they are definitely not absent of it. They've got it. What is so problematic is that they have empathy. They have the capacity for empathy. But the fact of the matter is, even armed with that, they choose not to use that empathy. That is a slap across the face. So let's break that down. First of all, it's important to understand empathy has two pieces. Number one, it's the piece of attempting to understand, reflect, and be present with the emotions or feelings of another person, even if you're not experiencing them, and perhaps even if you don't necessarily agree with them, that you would understand that a person may be sad or angry or have some other emotional state. But part two of empathy is being able to self-reflect on your impact on other people. So in the simplest example, empathy, the self part of empathy, the self-reflective part of empathy, is taking a minute before you react to someone to think about how your words and how your actions could affect somebody else. Because narcissists often just say and do what they want without thinking, that absence of empathy, the problem is that they hurt a lot of people. Because it's not that they have no empathy, they've got some, they know they've done something wrong. And 2 hours later, 6 hours later, 24 hours later, 5 weeks later, may come back to you to say, yeah, I can see how that made you upset, or I guess I'm sorry I said that. The apologies are kind of hollow, but they are apologies because they get that they did something wrong. But in the moment, their selfish, impulsive need means that they're willing to throw all that empathy stuff out of the window to do what feels right and necessary to them at that moment. But what a lot of people like to believe is that narcissists don't have any empathy, and that's not true. Like I said, they tend to have less. But I would actually argue that a lot of narcissists actually have a fully normal capacity for empathy. Think about your early stage, maybe in a romantic relationship with a narcissist, and you were being love bombed. Or think about when you were on a job working with a very charismatic narcissistic boss or colleague, and how attuned they were to you and remembering little details because they were trying to win you over on something. Or a narcissistic family member who was trying to get you on board with the thing that mattered to them. They were so hyper attuned to you at that moment that obviously they were able to be open and aware to your emotional state. One could argue that what narcissists do with empathy is that they weaponize empathy. Empathy, when used correctly, gives us a lot of information about the other person. It teaches us the sorts of triggers for sadness, the kinds of things that anger them or agitate them, the things that they feel anxious about, and any number of other situations or triggers that bring out strong emotions in a person. If you study that carefully enough, you better believe that you can then use that knowledge to manipulate that person. If you know what gets a rise out of that person, creates emotions out of them, if you're the narcissist and you're aware, which is empathy, of the other person's emotional state, when you need it, you can turn around and use that as a weapon, as a tool, as a way of manipulating them, as a way of getting a rise out of them, and then turning around and gaslighting them and saying, you're being too sensitive. This idea, though, that a narcissist could have a capacity for empathy, but then still be so uncaring and unfeeling, is a really, really difficult idea for people to get their head around. Because when it comes down to brass tacks at that point, what it means is that they really, really just don't care. They're not able to reel in their own reactions, their own responses, their own manipulations, even though you're feeling bad. It's as though when they need you and want you, they are hyper attuned to every feeling you have. But when they've discarded you, when they no longer need you, when you're no longer a convenience for them, then they have no problem just sort of stepping over your body, even if it's lying on the street in front of them. Because with most narcissistic people in our lives, there was at least one, and probably many more than one time, they showed what you experienced and likely was real empathy. They were able to connect with you. When that gets turned off, and you're in the face of somebody who literally doesn't care, that's absolutely chilling. You wouldn't care if somebody in the grocery store wasn't aware of your feelings. Let's say, I don't know, you started crying in the frozen food aisle because it reminded you of an ex-partner and you were very sad. If people just walked by you in the grocery store, maybe that wouldn't feel good, but you wouldn't be hurt by it. Why? Because those people never showed you empathy or feeling before. They're just going about their business. They don't know who you are. And maybe they think they're being empathic by giving you your private moment. It's really unsettling to have someone sometimes get it and sometimes not. You may wonder, at those times they don't get it, that they don't care. Is it just that their empathy is turned off? No. It's that they can't be bothered. It's almost as though exerting their empathy muscle is effortful for them. For a healthy person, it comes naturally. In fact, for a healthy person, if they were in that grocery store, walking by that person in the frozen food aisle who might have been crying, they might have actually stopped and checked in with that person and say, hey, are you okay? Just to make sure. That's empathy. And believe it or not, sometimes narcissists can do pretty good with stranger empathy. In fact, that's something that throws a lot of people off. They'll say, I don't get it. He is so awful to me, invalidating and mean and discarding and cruel and disrespectful. And yet, every time we walk into that coffee shop, He gives the person, the homeless person in the street in front of it, some money. I don't get it. Because stranger empathy is actually not that hard. It doesn't require anything more than a moment of recognition, whether it's asking someone in the street if they're okay, giving them $5. That's actually quick and easy. And for the narcissist, it plays on that communal narcissistic muscle. Aren't I a great person? I just gave $5. In fact, they often may reserve those actions of giving somebody on the street $5 for when they actually have an audience and somebody else is looking at them. They might only do the big tipping when they have an audience and other people are at the table. So this disconnect between somebody who can sometimes have their empathy and use it and sometimes not use it is unsettling. The empathy is always there. It doesn't stop and start. It's always there. It's about implementation. And narcissists are very, very discerning, sadly, about how they use it. It's as though it's something they don't want to give away, but more likely, they can't be bothered. If you're in a relationship with somebody, any kind of relationship, intimate, close relationship, marriage, family relationship, parent, sibling, friend, coworker, and the empathy goes up and down and all around, and it's there and it's not, look alive. Because what it likely means is that many, many times your feelings won't be considered, and you want to be very, very careful in those situations to be very, very, very mindful of not showing too many of the cards in your hand, of being very, very careful and guarded with your vulnerability. Because the most dangerous part, as I said, is the narcissist weaponizing empathy, of saying, they have an unbelievable ability to study another person and get the information they need and turn around and use it to harm that person. True love, true respect, that's shown when somebody shares a vulnerability and we don't use it as a weapon. In fact, we protect that vulnerability. We're very careful to not bring up that topic. An example could be, let's say you're a woman and you have children and you have a friend who's going through terrible experiences with infertility. You know that she is envious and jealous, but happy that you have kids, but it's hard for her. And then you get pregnant again, and you're very aware of what that conversation would do to your friend. You would be very mindful of it, you'd bring it up very carefully, you would check in on how she's feeling, but in the same breath too, if you had a friend who was going on and on, oh, I hate kids, I wish I never had kids, and so on and so forth, in front of this friend who was struggling with this, you would be very careful to protect that friend. Maybe by changing the conversation, maybe by taking that insensitive friend aside, but finding a way to protect your friend's vulnerability. That's respect, that's love. And so many people will say, oh my God, I was so open in this relationship with this narcissist. I shared everything with him or her. They made me believe I could share everything with them. And then, when the relationship started going off the rails, they took all of that information and they used it against me. Interestingly, the original idea for this video came from somebody who had written me an email. One of our YouTube subscribers, part of our YouTube community, had emailed me, I think from Germany. And she was the one who actually said, you know, you talk a lot about the empathy deficits in narcissists. And she was saying, actually, that's not what the neuroscience shows, that they actually have a fully intact capacity for empathy, which led me to do this deeper dive. And then I reflected on many of the conversations I've had with clients or doing seminars or workshops or even reading the research. And it really, really was such a good point. It is actually worse to be in contact with somebody who has empathy and chooses not to use it than to be with somebody who simply lacks it, a pattern we might see in something like, for example, psychopathy, where they have absolutely no feeling for another human being. So as you think about this, and you're in a relationship with a narcissistic person, guard your vulnerabilities once you realize that they turn their empathy on and off like a switch to their convenience. And you also have to engage in that radical acceptance that, yeah, they may actually not care about your feelings. And to accept that is often a motivator to make some really powerful changes in how you conduct yourself in that relationship. It's an incredibly painful thing to accept, But once you accept it, you're able to set better boundaries, have more realistic expectations, and be more self-protective in relationships that have tremendous potential to hurt you. It stinks to think that somebody would choose to use their empathy at their whim when it's such a critically important human characteristic. But it happens. It's a classical characteristic of narcissism. And if you encounter it, it hurts. Just receive it as a wake-up call. It is. Thanks again for tuning in. Again, please hit the bell, subscribe to this channel. You'll get updates, you'll get regular content, and you will know everything you wanted and more about narcissism. Thanks again.